Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into the weeds of the global electricity scene. Our guide is the International Energy Agency's latest Electricity 2025 report.
That's right.
Think of this as your kind of focused briefing on what's shaping power around the world, looking right now at 2025 to 2027, but also, further ahead.
And our job here is really to pull out the key insights from this pretty dense IEA analysis for you. We're looking at their take on trends, policy changes, and crucially, their forecasts for demand, supply, and CO2 emissions.
Okay.
It's a broad look covering data from 32 member countries, 13 association countries, so everything from oil and gas to renewables markets, you name it.
Right, and looking through it, the IEA zeroes in on a couple of really interesting points this year, doesn't it? There's a deep dive into China's changing power demand, and also this phenomenon of negative wholesale electricity prices. Kind of weird.
Exactly. And understanding all this is just becoming more and more vital. With weather getting more extreme, power systems expanding through electrification, adding more renewables, well, reliability, affordability, sustainability, these are critical questions for everyone.
Okay, so it's a big report. Where do we start to get the main picture? Let's talk global electricity demand first. What's the headline?
The big picture globally is strong growth expected right through 2027. But what's really interesting, something for you to watch, is who's driving it.
Okay.
Up until 2024, it was mainly emerging economies, right? But looking ahead, advanced economies are expected to pick up a bigger slice of that growth, maybe around 15% of the additional demand.
15%. That feels like a noticeable shift. What's behind that increase in the advanced economies then?
It's mostly down to electrifying transport,
Mm-hmm.
think EVs and heating, so heat pumps and the like, plus the huge expansion of data centers. That's a really good one, especially in the U.S.
Data centers. We hear a lot about those. And India. They've been a huge part of the demand growth story recently, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. India is projected to account for about 10% of the total global demand increase through 2027. That's significant.
Wow.
Yeah, it's fueled by strong economic growth, obviously,
Right.
but also a big jump in air conditioning use. Rising incomes, hotter temperatures, their peak load is climbing fast. And the report notes they're using things like time-of-use tariffs to try and manage it, encourage shifting use away from peak times. Definitely a key country to watch.
Time of use tariffs. Yeah, makes sense to smooth out those peaks. Now, you mentioned advanced economies, but the report flags some uncertainty around the EU's demand. What's going on there?
The main question mark for the EU is really about the recovery of its energy-intensive industries. How quickly will they bounce back, and what does that mean for electricity use?
I see.
We did see a tiny uptick in EU demand in 2024, maybe 0.7%, partly weather-related, heating and cooling. But the overall forecast got nudged down a bit because the broader economic outlook is just weaker.
So a bit of a break on demand in Europe, perhaps. The report also mentions that classic link between electricity use and GDP growth. Why bring that up now?
Well, historically, especially in emerging economies, there's this really tight correlation, right? More economic activity usually means more industry, more manufacturing, more services, all needing power.
Sure.
And conversely, having reliable, affordable electricity helps drive that growth. So tracking electricity consumption can be a sort of useful barometer for economic health.
Makes sense. More stuff happening means more power needed. So looking ahead to 2027, which sectors are expected to contribute most to this global demand increase?
Between 2025 and 2027, the forecast is that the industrial sector will be responsible for roughly 50% of the total additional electricity demand worldwide.
Half, just from industry. Okay, let's zoom in then on one of those special focus areas, China. Their power demand is evolving, and they have those big dual carbon goals, peak CO2 before 2030, carbon neutral before 2060. That must be shaping things significantly.
It absolutely is. Industrial electrification is a core part of their strategy for hitting those targets. And we're seeing this huge surge in automation in manufacturing. The number of industrial robots more than doubled since 2020.
Doubled.
Yeah. And the IEA estimates just that increase in automation might have added something like over 15 terawatt hours to demand between 2021 and 2024.
15 terawatt hours. That's a massive amount of energy.
It really is. Think of it like the annual consumption of a medium-sized country.
Wow. Okay, so robots plugging in. What else is driving China's demand?
New energy vehicles and EVs. That's another huge one. By 2024, they were about 9% of all vehicles on the road in China. Back in 2021, it was just 3%.
Huge jump.
And in 2024 alone, Over 11 million new NEVs registered. That's up 51% from the year before. So that shift from gasoline cars to electric is directly boosting electricity consumption.
51% increase year on year. That's incredible speed.
And then there's weather, right?
Yeah.
Particularly those heat waves they've been having. Absolutely critical factor. China had its hottest July and August in over 60 years back in 2024.
Oof.
And for the whole year, cooling degree days, which basically measure how much cooling is needed, were up 8% on 2023 and 14% above the average from 2017 to 2021. That kind of sustained, intense heat just sends demand for air conditioning through the roof.
So industry, EVs, and AC, a powerful mix driving demand. But they also have this huge computing project, don't they? The Eastern Data and Western Computing thing.
Yes, the EDWC initiative. It's a
Right.
major undertaking, huge investment, about $6 billion, aiming to ramp up national computing power. The strategy is to put these really energy-hungry data centers out in the western and northern regions where there's more renewable energy potential. By June 2024, they'd already installed a staggering 1.95 million server racks under this plan.
1.95 million racks, that's enormous. Are they thinking about efficiency with these things or just building them?
Oh, definitely thinking about efficiency. There's a strong push. They've set targets for power usage effectiveness, PUE, that's the key metric. Lower is better to get below 1.5 by the end of 2025.
Okay.
And they're also looking at water usage, WUE, carbon usage, CUE, making sure the centers run in higher capacity. And maybe, most impressively, the goal is for these EDWC data centers to get at least 80% of their electricity from renewables by 2025.
80% renewables for data centers. That's ambitious. Okay. Let's pivot now to India and those peak load challenges you mentioned earlier. Seems like a key point in the report.
Yes, it is. Even with policies like time of use tariffs trying to shift demand to daytime, to soak up solar power, India is facing a real crunch meeting its peak demand, especially in the evenings.
Right.
The India Energy and Climate Center reckons there could be evening power shortages of anywhere from 20 to 40 gigawatts by 2027. And that's with planned new power plants coming online.
20 to 40 gigawatts short? That's potentially massive. What about longer term?
Well, the National Electricity Plan is projecting peak demand could hit 458 gigawatt by 2032. That's
Great word.
83% higher than the peak in 2024.
83%. Good grief. That's stunning growth. Are they already struggling to meet demand now?
Yes, the shortfall in available capacity during peak hours is already a serious issue. In 2024, the forecast was that available capacity would be about 11 gigawatt lower than the actual peak load needed. That's a gap of 4.3%, and was particularly tight in the northern and eastern parts of the country.
Okay, so it's already happening. What did they actually do in 2024 to cope? Must have been tense.
They had to pull out some exceptional measures, yeah.
Yeah.
Things like keeping support going for plants using imported coal and gas, cutting back on planned maintenance shutdowns for existing plants, really trying to minimize unexpected outages.
Right. Did it work?
Ultimately, yes. They managed to meet that peak load of 250 gigawatt on May 30th, 2024, though turns out the actual peak was slightly lower than they first forecast. But yeah, it definitely shows how tight things are, the balancing act they're performing.
Sounds like they scraped through. Okay, let's jump across to the U.S. now. Electrification trends there. We hear a lot about EVs and electric heating. What's the report say?
Well, the pace of electrifying heating in the U.S. kind of moderated a bit between late 2022 and early 2024, but the overall growth trend is still expected to continue through 2027.
Okay.
Heat pump sales, which are key for electric heat, they dipped in 2023, but then bounced back later in 2024. And importantly, since 2021, heat pumps have actually been outselling traditional gas furnaces for home heating. So that indicates a real underlying shift.
So the trend's still up, maybe just cooled off slightly from the initial rush. What about EVs in the States?
Transport electrification has made big strides. Electric car share went from just 2% in 2019 up to 10% in 2024.
10%.
But similar to heating, the rate of growth slowed down in 2024. It was about a 10% year-on-year increase in sales compared to a huge 40% jump the year before. So maybe suggests the first big wave of adoption is stabilizing a bit.
Interesting. More EVs, but the acceleration has eased. Are there specific U.S. regions seeing particularly strong electricity demand growth?
Yes, definitely. The Western Interconnection that covers a big chunk of the West, they're looking at about 2% average annual growth. And the Desert Southwest region, Arizona, New Mexico, bits of Texas, California, even higher, around 3% a year.
And why there?
It's largely driven by big new facilities. Think large-scale industrial and commercial loads coming online.
Okay. And ERCOT, Texas. They always seem to be in the spotlight for grid issues and demand.
Oh, yeah. ERCOT is forecasting really strong demand growth. The drivers there are, well, It's a mix. Data centers again, crypto mining, industry electrifying, especially oil and gas, developing the hydrogen economy, plus ongoing EV adoption. They're projecting a pretty big jump in their summer peak demand needed by 2029.
Crypto mining keeps popping up. And NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, what's their big picture view for the U.S.?
NRC is projecting about a 1.7% compound annual growth rate for U.S. electricity consumption overall, out to 2034. But the really significant thing they see is a sharp rise in both summer and winter peak demand.
Oh, interesting. Reversing a trend.
Exactly. It reverses a 20-year trend of fairly flat or even declining growth in peak demand. And again, the main culprits are these large commercial and industrial users data centers and crypto mining featuring heavily.
Right, a clear shift. Those big users are really changing the game. Okay, let's cross the Atlantic now. The European Union, electricity demand there, but also this issue of industrial competitiveness.
Yeah, as we touched on, EU demand saw that small 0.7% rise in 2024, partly weather. But the overall forecast is cautious due to the weaker economy. And a major headache for the EU is definitely those high electricity prices and what they mean for industry competing globally.
They have been persistently high, haven't they? How much higher are we talking compared to, say, the US or China?
Even with some easing in 2024, prices for energy-intensive industries in the EU were still about 65% higher than back in 2019.
65%.
Yeah. And in 2024, they're running, on average, double the price in the US and about 50% higher than in China. That's a serious competitive disadvantage.
That's a massive difference. What's the real-world impact been on key manufacturing sectors in Europe?
It's causing real difficulties. The car industry is struggling with weak demand at home and tough export competition. Steel, while maybe seeing tiny signs of recovery, still faces low demand, foreign competition, those high energy costs, plus rising interest rates. It's led to plant closures, production cuts in several countries. The chemical sector shows maybe a little growth, but business confidence is shaky because of weak demand and, again, those energy prices. It's a tough climate for many basic industries.
Sounds incredibly challenging. Has there been much government help for these industries with energy costs?
There has been intervention, yeah, both at the EU level and nationally, mainly using the compensation mechanism tied to the EU emissions trading system, the EU ETS. But the support varies a lot between countries. Germany, for instance, made a big move to remove the cap on aid intensity for its industries. Spain, Italy, others have different caps and approaches. So it's a bit of a patchwork, which can actually create its own competitive issues within the EU.
A patchwork, right. What about the wider electrification push in Europe? EVs, for example. How are policies affecting that?
National EV subsidy policies have a really direct impact. You can see it clearly. Registrations dropped in Germany and France when they scaled back subsidies. But in countries like Belgium, where they kept strong supportive policies, EV adoption rates jumped up. Really highlights how much those government incentives matter for consumer choices.
Definitely shows the power of policy. One last thing on the EU, any particular barriers for households wanting to electrify?
Yeah, the report points to taxation policies. Basically, electricity often carries much higher taxes, fees, levies, all sorts of charges compared to natural gas when you look at it per unit of energy, per megawatt hour. So that price difference driven by taxes can make switching from gas heating or appliances to electric Qurix less attractive financially for households, potentially slowing things down.
That's interesting. Kind of a hidden barrier, maybe. Okay, let's shift gears now to something really dynamic. The boom in renewable energy worldwide, and the flip side, keeping the grid stable as all this variable power comes online.
Yeah, renewables deployment is really taking off, especially solar PV. Big milestone in the EU. Solar generation actually overtook coal generation in 2024.
Wow, overtook coal.
Yep, exceeded a 10% share of the total electricity mix. And China, the US, India, they're all expected to hit that 10% solar share mark by 2027 too. It shows the global momentum.
That's incredibly fast for solar. What's the overall renewables picture for the EU, though?
Very strong growth expected. About 7% average annual growth, hitting something like 56% of total electricity output by 2027.
56%?
Yeah, this big rise in renewables is set to push out generation from coal and gas, a major transformation underway in the EU's energy system.
56% renewables by 2027 is huge, but that reliance on wind and solar inevitably brings up the challenge of, well, what happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? That Dunkelflaut issue.
Exactly. Managing those periods is absolutely crucial for reliability. You need a whole toolkit. Enough dispatchable generation power you can turn on when needed, plus long-duration energy storage, ways for consumers to adjust their usage, demand-side flexibility, and strong connections between different grid areas.
Right.
The report looks at a case in Northern Europe in late 2024 where low wind and solar caused big price spikes in Germany and the Nordics. Shows the pressure points.
So the lights stayed on, but prices got volatile. What about the U.S.? Similar challenges.
Yeah, the Pacific Northwest had wind drought events during that polar vortex in January 2024. They managed okay, largely thanks to hydropower stepping in. But a study mentioned in the report warns these energy droughts. Low wind and solar can last up to 6 days in some parts of the U.S. It really hammers home the need for enough dispatchable power and, critically, developing more long-duration storage. Things like pumped hydro, thermal storage, maybe hydrogen eventually.
Long-duration storage really seems like the missing piece for a high renewables grid.
Okay, let's talk about something that sounds backwards. Electricity prices going negative.
Yeah, it's happening more often in certain markets. Finland, Texas, Southern California, Germany, parts of Australia.
So it's not just a one-off.
No, becoming more common. Even though average EU wholesale prices are still high compared to the past and U.S. prices are fairly stable, the Nordics actually saw prices drop in 2024 because they had so much hydropower.
But negative prices, how does that even happen? It feels wrong.
Yeah.
It's down to a few things working together. A big factor is regulatory and contractual inflexibility. Things like feed-in tariffs or certain types of contracts for renewables mean generators might keep producing power even when the market price dips below zero, because they still get paid their guaranteed rate.
Oh, okay.
Also, some big thermal power plants aren't very flexible. They can't easily ramp down, and sometimes subsidies for fossil fuels can keep them running too. Basically, these mechanisms sometimes encourage maximizing output, not responding perfectly to short-term prices.
So incentives and technical limits kind of clashing with market signals. What's the effect of these negative prices? Can't be good for the producers getting them.
Well, not if they're exposed directly to the market price, no.
Yeah.
But it does create interesting opportunities for energy storage.
How so?
Batteries can charge up when the price is negative, essentially getting paid to take electricity and then sell it back later when prices are positive. It creates an arbitrage opportunity.
Right. Buy low, sell high, extremely low in this case.
Exactly. And that dynamic is definitely helping drive investment in utility-scale batteries. We saw Australia run its first tender specifically for long-duration storage projects recently. So, weirdly, negative prices can actually help deploy the flexibility the grid needs.
A strange silver lining for storage. Now, the price we pay isn't just the wholesale generation costs. There are grid tariffs, transmission, distribution costs. What's happening with those?
Yeah, expect those to go up. Expanding the grid for electrification, integrating all these renewables, adding digitalization, storage, stability services, it all costs money for infrastructure upgrades. We're already seeing that grid component of bills rising in places like the U.S., Italy, Spain, France, Poland, and others.
So even if renewable generation gets cheaper, our bills might not drop as much because grid costs are rising to handle it.
That's definitely a real possibility, yeah.
Yeah.
And how those grid costs get shared out varies a lot, too. Germany and the Netherlands, for example, often give big discounts on grid fees to large industrial users. Spain, not so much. These policy choices matter for different consumers.
Interesting, those allocation decisions. What about grid congestion? Traffic jams on the power lines. Does that add to costs?
It can, significantly in some places.
Yeah.
Germany, parts of the U.S., Great Britain, managing congestion, maybe paying power plants to change their output, or sometimes curtailing renewables. Those actions cost money, and it often feeds back into tariffs eventually. Different countries handle who pays for that differently, too.
Sounds like grid modernization is a huge, costly task ahead. And with energy supply and demand both getting more weather-dependent, reliability must be an even bigger focus.
Oh, absolutely critical. We're really in a new phase where extreme weather hits both sides.
Yeah.
Demand spikes from heat waves, supply disruptions from storms knocking out lines, droughts hitting hydropower. Resilient systems are non-negotiable now.
Yeah.
The IEA report lists loads of examples just from 2024. Winter storms and hurricanes in the U.S., big storms in Australia, droughts affecting hydro in Ecuador and Colombia, power outages elsewhere due to infrastructure problems or fuel shortages. It's a constant reminder of vulnerabilities.
Definitely drives home the need for robust infrastructure. So how is planning evolving to cope, making sure there's enough power available in this more volatile world?
The old ways of planning, like just having a fixed planning reserve margin, a simple buffer of extra capacity, they're looking a bit limited now.
Right.
We need to consider a much wider range of weather scenarios, the chance of multiple things going wrong at once. So there's a move towards more sophisticated methods like stochastic modeling, using probabilities to look at lots of potential outcomes, and really deep analysis of specific extreme weather risks. ERCOT in Texas, for example, is now running detailed winter storm simulations to test their system's adequacy. It's about being more dynamic, more scenario-based.
No complex, adaptive approach needed. Okay, the report digs into specific regions too. Any key highlights from around the world you want to pull out for us?
Yeah, lots happening regionally. Quick tour. In China, coal's still key for flexibility, despite renewables growth. They're mandating retrofits for coal plants. But new laws also firmly establish renewables as primary energy. India, huge renewables growth, aiming for 500 GW non-fossil by 2030, big push on rooftop solar, building their own solar manufacturing, investing in storage. Japan, looking at potentially doubling renewable targets by 2040, plus a nuclear comeback. South Korea, expanding renewable supply chain, focusing on offshore wind auctions. Indonesia, big renewable projects like floating solar, part of that JETP transition plan, looking at carbon management, exporting clean power to Singapore. Vietnam, also a JETP member, ambitious renewables target, no new coal after 2030, focus on storage and grid stability. Thailand, renewables target in their draft plan, bringing in PPAs for renewables.
Yeah.
Singapore, raising targets for importing low-emissions electricity, grid stability measures, cross-border trade. U.S. strong backing for small modular reactors, SMRs, and nuclear power generally. Brazil, tackling renewables curtailment, moving towards more competitive power markets. Chile, dealt with major storm outages, measures to stabilize bills. Colombia, low hydro output caused problems, had to restrict exports.
Right, a lot happening in the Americas too.
Then the EU, focusing on critical raw materials for the transition. Major electricity market design reforms underway, CFDs, PPAs, crisis measures, consumer protection, expanding carbon pricing with ETS and the border tax, CBAM, nationally. France, phasing out the ARENH nuclear mechanism. Italy, progressing on coal, phase out grid links. Poland, reforming its balancing market, capping prices, moving on nuclear, investing in renewables and storage. Denmark, expanding its grid for renewables, joined a key balancing market. Ireland, boosting renewables, great investment, converting an old coal plant to oil for backup.
Busy times in Europe.
Turkey, strong demand growth, hydro rebound. Ukraine,
Yeah.
facing huge generation capacity losses from the conflict, relying more on nuclear and renewables, seeking alternatives. Saudi Arabia, big investment in gas power plants to use less oil for electricity. South Africa, seeing better performance from coal plants, limiting load shedding, but also big expansion plans for coal, solar, nuclear, and moving towards liberalizing the sector.
Oh, Africa too.
Algeria, record peak demand, grid work, but power plant delays. Renewable plans, but low capacity now. Nigeria, gas supply issues hurting generation, but distributed solar growing, faces big challenges with low tariffs, debt, grid collapses, but reforms are starting. Kenya, high clean energy share, expanding access and distribution. Senegal, modernizing its transmission network. So yeah, everywhere you look, big changes, unique challenges.
A truly global picture of transformation and challenge. Finally, the report looks at global CO2 emissions from the power sector. What's the bottom line there?
Yeah, unfortunately, the current IEA forecast actually shows total CO2 emissions in the power sector increasing globally between 2024 and 2027.
Increasing, despite all the renewable growth.
Yes, it really highlights the scale of the challenge in fully decarbonizing electricity supply worldwide. Even with impressive renewables deployment, it's not yet enough to reverse the overall emissions trend in the power sector in the immediate term.
That's quite sobering, a stark reminder of how much more needs to be done.
It is. It just underlines the need for even faster deployment of clean energy, much better energy efficiency, developing and rolling out things like carbon capture, if we're serious about hitting climate goals.
Okay, so pulling this all together, what are the absolute key takeaways for our listeners from this deep dive into the IEA's Electricity 2025?
I think the main message is that we're in a time of really rapid change. Electricity demand and supply are shifting fast, driven by growth, electrification, and especially that increasing share of variable renewables.
Right.
And because of that, robust grids, flexible storage, dispatchable power, they're becoming absolutely critical for keeping the lights on reliably and securely. And crucially, remember, the picture looks very different depending on where you are in the world. Huge regional variations in trends and policies.
So what's the big aha moment you think someone listening should take away from all this?
For me, the real aha is seeing just how complex and interconnected everything is. It's not just about the tech like solar panels, it's this intricate dance between weather patterns, policy choices governments make, economic forces.
Hmm.
And maybe some of the surprising details, like those negative electricity prices and why they happen,
Right.
the mix of regulations and market quirks, it really shows how dynamic and, frankly, weird our energy systems are becoming as they change.
Yeah, absolutely. And understanding these global currents definitely helps you, our listener, make sense of energy policy debates, where tech investments might be going, the whole sustainability picture. So let me leave you with a final thought to chew on as we navigate all this change. What unforeseen challenges or maybe even unexpected opportunities might pop up that could completely throw these forecasts off course? Something to keep an eye on as the energy future unfolds. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.